Okay, I think we'll get started because condensing 12 weeks of quite dense lectures into one is pretty hard. We've got a fair bit of material to cover. So in this lecture I've tried to summarise the key points of the course, but do not assume that it covers everything that you will need to know in the exam. You need to understand what went on in the course, think about the connections between things. So if something could have been mentioned in lecture 3 that is then relevant in, another lecture much later on and things like that. So if you learn the key concepts and understand those connections, you'll do well in the exam. The only exception to that is lectures 11 and 12, because the exam was written well before those lectures were given or put together. So everything you need to know from those lectures, which is actually not a lot, is in the, for the exam, I point out, is in this lecture. But every other lecture I recommend that you study and you use those notes that have been put up there. If there's anything that you're not sure about, read what was written. Welcome to get in touch or ask at the tutorials this week. So this week's tutorials will look at any questions you have and the exam. So, it shouldn't take that long for a start. And if you feel confident about it, don't worry about it. All right, let's go. So what, I haven't done this well actually, but what I want to say in the outline is we'll try and work out what you've learnt, what is climate change and what's driving it, and what are the effects on both ecological and human systems, and how do we adapt and mitigate those effects to try and deal with it as best we can. And then we'll wrap up with why is climate change so difficult to deal with, because it's probably the greatest issue we're facing at the moment, and yet it still causes this massive problem. And then just very briefly, the things that I think are important to get us going into the future, which you will have your own opinions on and probably as good as or much better ideas anyway, so that's very personal at the end. So just a very quick wrap up. Everyone can hear me okay? Yeah, good. So the purpose of the course was to give you an understanding of what climate change is, how people in society see that issue, and what responses have we seen or what can we anticipate. And then the second point was to try and, specifically if you're doing a Bachelor of Environmental Management, which I know that everyone isn't doing, but understand how somebody working in environmental management can respond to those issues and problems that are coming up, because you'll be the on-the-ground people who are dealing with this stuff. And again, just very quickly to look at the course outcomes. So I wanted to build a knowledge and understanding of what climate change is and why it's happening, why it's an issue and what we can do. And they'll also give you, mainly through those essays and the tutorials, skills in actually preparing and understanding how to prepare risk and vulnerability assessments and adaptation plans. Understanding, why stakeholders are important and the issues you might come up talking to them and how to get around those issues and bring people on board, because that's one of the biggest problems that we face with climate change. And then understanding if people or communities are affected by some natural disaster or climate disruption, how you might, in your personal role, but also as your professional role, help with rebuilding or increasing resilience. So just some basic concepts. So the Earth is a system and the climate is a system or a bunch of systems connected, and ecological systems are systems, human systems are systems. So we need to understand that systems interact with the components within them and often with things outside them. So the Earth is actually a closed system, so it gets energy in and out, but it doesn't exchange matter, but most everything else is an open system. So we get both energy and matter in and release energy and matter. We also need to understand the difference between climate and weather. So one's a long-term record of weather, climate's a long-term record of weather, but the things that we experience often, the most obvious things we experience from climate change are weather-related, so there's storms and, storm surges and hurricanes and things like that. Climate change refers to a change in the conditions that last for a long time, typically decades or millennia or centuries. So it's not something that happens, you might have a couple of hot years, but that wouldn't necessarily be climate change. So it's a long-term trend. And the reason that climate is changing is largely because the available energy is changing, and that affects the intensity and duration and way that those systems interact. So that's the key driver of climate change. The greenhouse effect we'll look at in a little bit more detail, but obviously it's a way that the Earth's atmosphere traps warm air within itself, so that makes life on Earth livable in. We would not be living here if we didn't have the greenhouse effect. But what we're doing as humans is making that effect much stronger, and that's where the issue lies. And then resilience is really being able to absorb an impact and recover from it without losing your way or your functionality along the way. Okay, so across Earth's history, from right back here, beginning of the Earth, up to here, the present time, these are this is the mean temperature, and these are the variations on the black line. And you can see there's always been change. It's not a static thing. We've had large cold periods in these blue and white lines. We're at the moment in a glacial period, long-term glacial period. And there have been times when it's been quite a lot hotter, and most namely when the dinosaurs were around. When the dinosaurs were around, there were crocodiles in the Arctic Circle. There was no ice at the poles. The world was pretty tropical, and it was a lot hotter than it is now. It was 23 degrees-ish as opposed to 15 degrees. So the world has been a lot hotter in the past, but you will see that the way that the continents has moved around affects actually what we feel as heat now, and what we can't go back to and say, oh, well, it would be like it was in the Cretaceous, because the continents were completely different then, and that affects the weather systems, the climate systems. So over human history, both actually since humans evolved in a kind of very descending from the ape kind of thing a couple of million years ago, but particularly as modern humans, Homo sapiens, which were, 100,000 odd years ago, 150,000, we've lived in a very stable temperature that has suited our ability. Now within that there have been lots of variations which have driven massive migrations, massive changes in species distribution, people moving out of Africa a couple of times and settling around the world. But the overall temperature has only varied within maybe 4 or 5 degrees of what we have now, and that's mainly been cooler than what we have now, not warmer. So you can see that this graph looks at the last 20,000 years, so that's the last ice age that we had, not the big one, but the most recent one. And since then, very quickly, temperatures rose from about 4 degrees cooler to roughly what we have now, and then they haven't varied in the last 10,000 years. And that's when all our civilizations and ways of life that we know now have been created. So basically the whole of human civilization is tucked into that one period where it's not changed at all. And that's something to bear in mind. And here at the end, you can see the trajectory that's forecast. This bar here is the range of forecasts in the IPCC, so we're showing you going to the middle of that. We could be up here, we could be down here. And you can see that that's much hotter than anything we've had before that we know about as civilizations that, around the world. So I guess the point of that is that we're going into uncharted territory, that we just have no concept of how fast things will change, what the effects will be on us, our civilizations, our cities and farmlands and things like that. And that's the big danger for us, not that the Earth is going to blow up and melt, but that we will not survive in any recognizable form, which obviously we'd try to avoid. So the greenhouse effect, as mentioned, it's basically we have incoming solar radiation. Some of that is reflected back before it hits the Earth's surface, and some of it comes down and hits the Earth's surface. Of the stuff that hits the Earth's surface, again, some of it is reflected back out again. some of it bounces around within the atmosphere and then is reflected back out. But ultimately, the incoming and the outgoing add up. So it's what happens in the middle when it's bouncing around. That is the greenhouse effect, and that's what we are influencing as people through our emissions. And so the system isn't really changing in terms of it's not getting more and keeping more, it's just keeping more for a while before it gets bounced out again. So the drivers of climate change are what's in the system, so what's bouncing around in there, what are the forcings, so how much radiation is coming in, which does vary over time, how much is reflected back and how much is stored in the soil or something and then reflected out again. It's also affected by both positive and negative feedbacks, but obviously more noticeably by positive feedbacks, which is that as it gets hotter, something happens that increases the heat rather than decreases it, which would be a negative feedback. We'll look at that in a minute. And then we have, on top of that, natural system, which has been around varying for a long time. We have anthropogenic contributions. And these come a lot from fossil fuels, a lot from forest clearing, because trees are a negative feedback on the Earth's climate. A lot from industrial processes that generate greenhouse gases, particularly things like cement, which is a carbon dioxide emitter. We have a lot of methane from grazing animals. We see later on that methane is a very potent greenhouse gas, much, much more potent than CO2. It's just there's not so much of it around in the atmosphere and it doesn't last so long. And then things like nitrogen fertilizer, which again has increased big time in the last 50, 60 years. And so the graph at the bottom, you probably remember, this shows the contribution of different forcings. So we have volcanoes, which obviously vary a lot depending on what's being exploded, but they actually tend to cool the atmosphere because they put particles into the air which reflect back solar radiation and also act as cloud seeder things, and so they don't have a positive effect on, even though you think of volcanoes very hot, and I'm sure that's why people think they do have a positive effect, they don't. We also have the sun's energy, which is pretty stable. Over this time cycle, obviously over long time cycles it varies. And we have land use change, which has added a lot, but again not so much visible here, but over time it would have added quite a lot. So all the massive deforestation in Europe and things like that took place in the last millennia would have contributed. But you can see the obvious one is the greenhouse gas emissions. And so that's a variety of greenhouse gases that contribute a lot to global warming. All right, so this is just a reminder that the Earth is a system. So what we have is we have the atmosphere, which is one system. These all interact. We then have the lithosphere, which is the ground, so rocks and soils. We have the hydrosphere, which is oceans and rivers and lakes. We have the biosphere, which is all the living bits and bobs in there. And so those interactions, so a change in one of those systems actually then affects the others, and that often leads to the kind of weather events that we think about, or sea level rise or something like that. So basically we're changing the atmosphere and we're changing the land, and we're changing the kind of what's in the ocean. So in terms of CO2 absorption and things like that, the reason that climate change hasn't risen a lot, or temperatures haven't risen a lot, is because the ocean has absorbed much more than was predicted, but it has a finite limit of how much heat it can absorb, how much CO2 it can absorb. So one of the most important things with climate is understanding those system interactions. So here we're looking at the big system interactions, so that really drive regional and global climate. So they link across thousands of kilometers, possibly tens of thousands of kilometers. So one example is the Rossby waves. If you remember, those were those polar waves that circle around the poles, both ends of the Earth. And they drive hot and cold cells moving across the mid-latitudes in the northern hemisphere and also the southern hemisphere, but we don't notice it much because it's mainly ocean in the southern hemisphere. They also have an effect on a lot of other weather. We'll have an illustration of that a bit later on. So you can't isolate that and just say it only operates, between latitude kind of 70 and 40 or something like that. It doesn't work that way. We also have the big oscillations. So those are mainly to do with changes in sea surface temperatures. El Nino particularly is a shift of warm water from the around Australia and the Southeast Asia district over towards the Central Pacific. And that swings both temperature and also drought conditions or flood conditions from the Americas to the Asia, Australasian area and back again over usually about 7 to 10 years, but sometimes you get a little cycle of them sooner than that. The North Atlantic Oscillation obviously operates up in between the US and Europe. We also have things like the monsoon system. So they operate again around the world, in the mid-latitudes and the tropics rather. And they're driven by basically heat and pressure differentials over land. So as you get hot air, it rises and causes low pressure, and that sucks in moist air from the ocean. And the differential is greatest in the summer, which is why you get summer monsoon rains. And occasionally in other places when that cycle swings back again, which it has to do, you get winter monsoons. And the other big one is the ocean current. So if you remember, whoops, no, sorry, that was the wrong, I thought I had my diagram there, but I've got it on another slide. So if you remember, the ocean currents circulate around the world, but they circulate not only in space horizontally, but also vertically through the ocean, driving hot and cold water up through the oceans of the world, and that affects climate a lot. And those changes to those things are potentially the big unknowns that we just have no concept of what will flip them, whether they, what impacts they will have if they do flip or whatever. So they're the big blanks in our climate modelling predictions. So one of the other key things with our systems are feedback mechanisms. So basically a positive feedback will push a system further in the direction it's already going. So for instance, if the sea ice melts up in the Arctic, the weather gets warmer because you're changing the albedo and you're changing the temperature of the water because you don't have the sea ice cover. And that obviously melts more sea ice, and so there's a feedback that's positive and melts more sea ice. The other one is that is a negative feedback. So one of the obvious ones is forest growth. So forest absorbs CO2 and produces evapotranspiration, which uses latent heat. So the Earth becomes cooler and the atmosphere, when that's released, becomes warmer, but high up in the atmosphere. The other thing, which I think is illustrated here, is weathering of limestone rocks, which is what puts carbon into the oceans from the land and counteracts acidification, if you remember that cycle. And so then the other big one that I mentioned earlier, which we do have the photo, the graphic here of the ocean currents, so the hot and cold, hot red obviously and cold blue, is when your system operates, what it has is feedback mechanisms that say there's a little change going on. Do I need to react to that? Yes, I do. No, I don't. And any system has that. But eventually you'll reach a tipping point or a threshold where it says, I can't cope with this anymore. I'm going to actually go into a new different state. And, the whole thing will change potentially. And so the big ones that are, as I say, not known exactly what effect they'll have, but pretty disastrous in general, are changes in these big ocean currents, particularly this North Atlantic one, usually from the greenhouse ice melting, which will put a lot of fresh water in, which changes the temperature. So where this hot water is coming up, that won't be coming up anymore. It won't be going down, the colder water, and so that will change that system. And the reason that Europe is quite pleasant and warm is because of that Gulf Stream warm current going across here, if I can get it to work. So if that changes, then Europe becomes quite cold and unpleasant. So we don't want that to change. The other big one, won't talk about volcanoes because they're relatively short-lived, and I don't think there's going to be a massive, huge volcanic eruption system, but is methane hydrates and methane in permafrost. Because methane is a very potent gas, as I said, it's 25, 26 times more potent than CO2, and they're massive stores not only at the bottom of the ocean, kept there by cold temperatures and pressure, but also in the permafrost. So as the permafrost starts to melt, that methane will start to be released, and as the ocean starts to warm, potentially the methane there will start to be released. And that's one of those things that people just don't really have an idea of how much could be released and what the actual effect would be. So they're the big kind of unknowns in the climate predictions. Okay, we're doing all right. All right, so climate forcing. So we have greenhouse gases, which we all know about, a whole variety of them. We also have orbital forcings. So if you remember these from lecture 2, they were changes in the Earth's orbit, which is this first one. So it doesn't orbit circularly, it orbits in an egg shape, an ellipse shape. And that's a long-term change, roughly 100,000 years. It also tilts in rotation, so it wobbles to and fro, and that again affects what part of the Earth is hit by solar radiation, and therefore what the temperature effect is, depending on the surface that it's hitting. And it also has a round and round wobble that kind of, is just not stable. So it's like a spinning top. When it starts to slow down, it starts to wobble. So those are the 3 Milankovitch cycles which drive long-term changes in temperature that people sort of tend to think are, responsible for climate change, and they are to some extent, but not to the extent that people hope they will be. There's also volcanic influences. Again, that's a cooling influence. And then there are land surface feedbacks. So I've moved on to the land surface feedbacks because they logically go in the next thing. So if you remember, there's a big interaction between the surface of the Earth, or the water, and the atmosphere. And so we have things like, heat and gas exchanges that drive or modify temperature and climate change. And the reason that that's important is because as people, we've changed a large part of the Earth to a different land use. So to grow crops, to have pasture and stuff like that. So what was here naturally is being changed all the time, and that will continue to happen because obviously our population's increasing, so we need more food and things. We also have, don't worry about the terms, we have biogeophysics, which is the study of heat and moisture and momentum, and we have biogeochemistry, which is the study of the gassy bits of it. So if you remember, our kind of diagram was albedo, surface roughness, physiology, which is transpiration, evapotranspiration, and soil moisture. So heat fluxes are the principal way that heat is moved around in the atmosphere, and heat drives things like evaporation and stuff like that, so it affects the moisture side of the cycle as well. So incoming solar radiation, if you remember, once it's kind of got through to the Earth's surface, it's dissipated in 3 ways. So it's dissipated by wind, so it can be blown horizontally or it can be lifted up in the atmosphere vertically. It's cooled by evapotranspiration, so as the water is evaporated, it cools the air, and then as it's released in a cloud, it warms the air, and it can be stored in the soil. And this changes not only daily, but seasonally and by latitude. We also had latent and sensible heat. So the latent heat is the one that changes the state, so changes water to gas, water vapor, and back again. Sensible heat is like going from the shade to the sun. It's what you actually feel as a temperature change. So one example of the latent heat is if you think about going around the back of a fridge, it's pretty hot around there because that heat exchange is cooling the air in the fridge and warming the air outside the fridge in that process. And those heat fluxes relate to the albedo, which is the reflectivity of the Earth, surface roughness, which affects how much it circulates within the atmosphere from the Earth's surface, and then evapotranspiration. So the albedo was a very critical one, because what happens is that depending on the colour of the surface, obviously not necessarily colour, but it has a very, very strong effect on whether the air gets hotter or the heat is stored down there, or whether it gets reflected straight out again. So cool surfaces which are close to white reflect albedo, and they're the nearer 1 value of albedo. And very hot, very black surfaces will absorb. So if you ever go into a place that's got either black sand or black peat soils or anything like that, they get very, very hot. So walking on black sand is horrible if it's really hot. And they tend to be obviously high at the poles because there's a lot of ice, and low in the mid-latitudes because there's more forest, mid and tropical latitudes. And the average albedo is about 31. So the ice is around about 85, something like that. Forest is around about 0.1. And so you can see that the average kind of works out at around 0.3. The other key one is surface roughness. So that creates turbulence. So if you have a very smooth surface, the wind just blows horizontally across it. You have a slight effect of heating, but not that much. But if you have a turbulent, if you have a rough surface like a forest, it creates turbulence which mixes the air more effectively, and that therefore draws hot air away from the surface up into the atmosphere. So that's why if you go into a forest, it's a lot cooler, partly why it is, because that hot air is being transferred from the surface to the surface to the atmosphere, whereas if you're out in a field, it's just hitting you and the Earth's surface. We also have moisture cycles. So moisture is probably the really critical thing. Like, we can survive being cold, but we can't survive without water, and nothing else much can survive without water. Nothing at all can survive without water, but some things can last a bit longer. And so water comes from evaporation or transpiration. So evaporation is off either mainly ocean, soils, bit off vegetation. Transpiration is actually the vegetation breathing, so they push out water vapor in their process of getting food and things like that from the CO2. So water vapor is then transferred from the surface to the atmosphere. Up in the atmosphere, it then condenses to form clouds, and it then comes down again in a variety of forms as rain, mist, snow, whatever. And that then either runs into rivers or soaks into the ground. And there can be a lot of transfer by wind, or when it's up in the atmosphere, so those clouds move around, the air parcels move around, driven by heat and pressure differences, and by the Earth's circulation, so that Coriolis effect, because the Earth's turning, it circulates winds around it. All right, we're going to have a break. We're going to have a break in a little while. Okay, so the other key thing then was, we've got our biophysical feedbacks, is what's going into the atmosphere that can form cloud nuclei, because clouds are very important coolers of the Earth's atmosphere. So an aerosol is anything that kind of is in the atmosphere that can act as a cloud condensation nucleus. We have a bunch of natural aerosols, so that can be things like sea salt, particles from forest trees and things like that, be steam, can be smoke, sulfates, explosions from volcanoes and stuff. We then have a lot of anthropogenic or man-made aerosols, which include chemicals, coal soot, agricultural inputs, dust and things like that, and volatile organic compounds, which are chemical compounds that sort of form in the atmosphere and then disappear as they have a chemical reaction with what's around them. And so their role in climate change is actually a mixed one. So the first one is that they can cool the surface. So one of the reasons that there was a coolish period in the 60s was thought to be because they had bad pollution, and therefore it reflected solar radiation up into the air before it got to the surface, and that kept the Earth a little bit cooler than it would otherwise have been. They can also, of course, once you start to get clouds forming, you start to trap air underneath as well as reflecting it. So if you have more trapping underneath of hot air, it will warm up, and if you have more reflection off the top, it will cool down. And they obviously have an important part in creating those clouds. don't worry about this in terms of information. I don't want you to sweat on it. It's information for you to just think about. It's not in the exam. You don't have to know numbers or anything like that. So basically, the most heat in the air is absorbed by water vapor. So water vapor is not terribly efficient at it, but it's very prevalent in the air. The other ones that we know about commonly are carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, which are the main greenhouse gases, obviously carbon dioxide being the biggest one. So that absorbs about a quarter of the heat in the atmosphere, and that comes from fossil fuels and land clearing. Methane's normally from livestock, emissions from gas and things like that, but not sort of in such great amounts at the moment. Nitrous oxide is from agriculture and waste and industry, things like fertilizer. And there's a bunch of other ones that, although ozone contributes quite a lot, the others are more sort of to do with industry and synthetic gases. So CFCs, which were bad for the ozone layer and got banned in the 1980s and 90s, they got replaced by hydrofluorocarbons, which are obviously very bad greenhouse gases but aren't making a hole in the ozone layer. And just to give you a concept of some of the differences, so these are the common gases and these are the residence time in the atmosphere. So you can see that methane, for all its power, doesn't last very long before it's broken down. Carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide last quite a long time. Some of these can last a very long time, so it's just as well they're very small quantities. And compared with CO2, their global warming effect is 26 times 216 times and up to 20,000 times. So you can see that, you know, what we put into the atmosphere potentially as industrial emissions from, you know, our more advanced sort of processes can actually be having a bad effect. So the critical thing that we think about with climate change is carbon cycle, obviously. So CO2 is the gas that we know is contributing. We know we're putting it out in large emissions, and we know that actually we can stop doing that if we put our efforts into doing that. So basically, you'll probably remember that we have big stores of it. We have stores in oil and gas and coal. We have stores in various limestone rocks. And we have big marine deposits on the seafloor, which are those hydrochlorites. We also have a lot in the actual ocean water, and we have a fair bit in the atmosphere, and we have a fair bit in forest cover and other vegetation types. But what we're doing is that natural cycle, which is working in here, is suddenly being disrupted by the fact that we are digging this stuff up, whoops, can't click, obviously, and burning it. And so we're putting this stored carbon dioxide bang into the atmosphere at a rate that there's no possibility that the Earth can actually deal with by, you know, absorbing that. And so, you know, the kind of concept that we can plant lots of trees and things like that, it just doesn't have the ability to cope with that level of emissions. So it can make a contribution, but we really have to stop the emissions or really cut down on the emissions before we can do anything much about climate change. So just the last thing of the actual what is climate change and what's it doing. This is a graph of the last 1,000 years rather. And so it shows the correlation between CO2 and temperature. So you can see that CO2 has been relatively steady up until the kind of middle of the 1800s. And CO2, I mean, temperature's obviously wobbled up and down because it's affected by things like, you know, volcanic explosions, changes in the solar cycles, things like that. So that's kind of, you know, fair enough. But the track is the same. And then suddenly, after the mid-1800s, we start to get this massive increase in both temperature and CO2. So there's a smoking gun there that sort of says, you know, whatever your reasoning is that it could be something else, it's actually very likely that those two are connected. And it was proposed like 100 years ago that they were connected, so it's not a new thing. All right. So now we're going to look at some of the effects of climate change on ecological systems, human systems, and the Earth system itself. So I'm not going to go into these in a lot of detail because we went over them ad infinitum earlier on. But basically, because of the extra energy that's in the system, we're going to see a lot of extreme weather events. We're going to see changes in regional climates. We're going to see changes in sea level, driven not only by temperature expansion, but also by input of melting land ice. We're also going to see ocean acidification because the ocean is busy absorbing CO2, and that changes into carbonic acid in the water, and it's countered by absorbing limestone from the land weathering of rocks, and that can't occur at the right pace, so we're going to see ocean acidification. There's also big effects on biodiversity. There's a couple of things that are not implicated, which is, volcanic eruptions and seismic events, but in fact there is some evidence that they are connected to temperature rises and things like that, so we can't totally discount them. They're definitely not caused by climate change. So our extreme weather events, so just to hammer the point home, we're not changing what we get, we're just changing how long it is, how intense it is, and how, kind of much it affects the Earth. So we had a big list of things. So there were a bunch of different storms like cyclones and superstorms, tornadoes and ice storms and things like that, which are all going to get more intense and drop a lot more rain, have much stronger winds and things associated with them. They're already very strong, damaging events. If you remember, we looked at that thing of how many Category 5 cyclones had come through, and there was maybe one in the 20th century, and there'd already been 5 or 6 already in the 21st century in the 10 years that we've had, or 15 years that we've had here. So you can see there's been a quite marked change in that. Obviously, the more rain you have, the more likely you are to have things like floods. And the less rain you have, paradoxically, of course, you then have droughts. So as you get more rain in one place, you get less rain in another place. So the common thing that we have droughts in Australia when the El Niño's on, and the west coast of North and South America are having massive floods and rain, because that's the way that system oscillates through the thing. We also have a risk of having more fires because it'll be hotter. And so fires start better when it's hotter. We'll have more fuel potentially because we might have more growth of vegetation and stuff like that as well. And we'll have heat waves, which are the one thing that is very strongly linked already to climate change and is undeniably related to climate change. So we'll also have our shifts in our regional climates. So this is much slower acting, but we can already see evidence that it's happening. And what's happening is that ecoregions or climates, ecological zones are moving towards the poles because they're tracking the hotter weather. So each part of the Earth has a kind of temperature envelope that it lives in, and as that temperature envelope particularly gets moved, it will follow that temperature envelope, trying to keep within its comfort zone. It also works with rain, but rain is much more complex, so it doesn't have quite as neat a pattern as temperature. And so you can see from the graph that as the mean increases, we'll have less cold weather and we'll have more hot weather. So the mean doesn't mean that we're going to have a 1 degree increase and that's fine, we can all cope with a 1 degree increase. It means we're going to have lots more heat waves and we're going to have lots less cold weather. Now that might be a good thing in terms of, cold weather can be bad, but it also is essential for some plants and animals and things like that to have that cold weather, so they'll be quite badly affected. So one of the things that's anything that lives in a cold place that relies on being around a glacier or on an ice sheet or sea ice, like the obvious polar bear picture and stuff like that, and up in those permafrost areas, is going to be badly affected because they're shrinking big time. We'll have changes in rainfall. So where does rainfall occur? So that's actually going to have a massive impact on our systems of where we live, where we do agriculture, and things like that, because things like the Corn Belt in America may well become a lot drier, and therefore it may become like the Dust Bowl in the 1930s, where you actually can't grow things there anymore, and that agricultural zone will move up to Canada, for instance, or something. So then that's a big shift in, the US being able to supply its food and its biofuels and things, as an extreme example, suddenly moving into Canada. And you think, well, Canada's going to be rubbing its hands, but is the US going to be upset about that? We'll have changes in ecosystem, and the problem is not that species necessarily will move, but that whole ecosystems will change, because some species will be able to adapt better than others, so they will move on their way. Others won't be able to move at all, and so you'll end up with mismatches between what a species needs and what it has in its climate envelope. And then we have, I said, implications for land use, which is probably one of the most important ones as a human, from a human point of view. And just as an example, so this isn't anything, there's lots of other examples I could have given, but melting sea ice is affecting the jet stream. So that's that polar circulation vortex. And that's because it's changing the temperature gradient between the polar cell and the Ferrel cell. So if you remember, there were Hadley, Ferrel, and polar cells that were huge, climate systems that go from the tropics up to the polar regions, and determine where it's rainy and where it's dry in that particular system. So the deserts of the world occur in the middle of a Hadley cell. Anyway, so that is not only affecting what's happening in the sea ice, but it's also affecting big winter storms and big heat waves, because as those waves sort of change pattern and get isolated because of the change in temperature gradient, they trap hot air and cold air. It also causes drought and floods around the world, so in regions that are nothing to do with where those Rossby waves are actually travelling. And it can change the North Atlantic oscillation pattern, so again, that's that temperature changes in the North Atlantic. Potentially, if we start to melt the Greenland ice sheet, continue to melt the Greenland ice sheet, we'll change that North Atlantic ocean circulation, and that then affects the whole climate system through Northern Europe in particular. So what seemed like nice, pleasant, warm Western England will suddenly become quite a cold place, and it might cause more hurricanes. And obviously, we won't have sea level rise from sea ice, we'll only have it from land rise, so remember that. Sea ice doesn't affect sea level rise. But what does affect sea level rise is temperature mainly at the moment, and also melting land ice. So what's happened is that the sea level has been rising slowly, and then just over the last few years it's accelerated much more than people thought it was. So it's rising at about 1.5 mil a year, and suddenly it's rising at 3 mil a year. And that means that in 100 years, if nothing else happens, like the ice sheets melting, we'll probably have between 1 and 2 meters. If the ice sheets melt, it will be a lot more than that. So anywhere that's living in any city that's on the coast, which is a lot of cities around the world, those cities will be strongly affected by the sea level rise. And in reality, protecting a city from sea level rise is not only very expensive, but probably impossible in reality. And then the final one on the Earth systems that operate is ocean acidification. So if you remember, the ocean is it's slightly alkaline, so it's about 8.1 or something like that on the scale of pH scale, with the neutral value being 7. And the issue with the ocean, what you can see here, that here's CO2 rising, here's the ocean acidifying. So again, it's a pretty good relationship between those two factors. Around the world it differs, so that 8 would be an average pH, so it's more acidic up here, and it's more alkaline in the tropics. In the mid-latitudes. But the issue is that this absorption of CO2 by water by the ocean has always gone on, but it's been counteracted by calcium carbonate from weathered rocks, and that system is not fast enough to counteract the human emissions. Okay, so we're going to look at ecological consequences and then human consequences, and then we'll just have a very short 5-minute break to let everyone relax for a bit, because I know it's very full-on lecture. So basically, the ecological consequences is that through time, species have moved around always. As climates change, they've reacted to that. And the way that they've survived in places where the climate's changed that they haven't been able to adapt to by moving is by having a refugia. So they find a little place that could be, 100 square kilometres, it could be much bigger than that, that they can still has those conditions. So it may be that it's on a south-facing slope or something like that, that has those conditions, and they can survive that particular phase of climate, and when it changes, they can move out again and recolonize. But that depends totally on connectivity. So if they can't move, and this is the big change that we've created by our own modification of the Earth's surface, is that they can't move out again. So, if it's got a massive agricultural belt or something like that, a tree won't be able to kind of shuffle across that if it's getting ploughed up. So that's the kind of danger that we face with refugia now as opposed to refugia in the past. And the other thing is that because we're changing the system so quickly, the predictions are that we'll have novel climates very shortly if we don't have them already. And so if you remember from this diagram, these were global novel climates. So these red and orange areas are where it's completely different conditions from anything they have now. And these were, bottom ones were novel climates within 500 kilometres, allowing for the fact that it'll take a species quite a long time to move 500 kilometres, and therefore beyond that they probably won't be able to move anyway. And so you can see that if you look at that side of it, under an extreme scenario, pretty much most of the Earth becomes a novel climate for species, and so they may be able to adapt, they may be able to move, but the likelihood is that a fair number of them can't do that. And those ecosystem disruption from climate stress, mainly for heat and moisture, is going to be not only effect, but also the way that things can adapt, I suppose, is through whether they can change their life history or their plasticity, whether they've got enough genetic variation within their population to deal with changes, so the ones that aren't adapted die out, the ones that are adapted survive. It'll change things like phenology, so the timing of different events, and it'll change ranges of current species. So things like birds and things like that can move pretty easily, but trees can't move very easily. It's a very slow process for a tree to move its range. And then there'll be actual ecosystem changes because of differential movement between different species. So ecophysiology, if you remember from Natalie's part of the lecture, was about how animals and plants have a climate niche that they fit into. And so within that, they have some flexibility, and we obviously don't know the full flexibility because we haven't really tested it over, probably take, millions of years to test that. But that allows them to kind of live and breed and have their habitat sort of within an area. But it's often quite narrow, and particularly for fish and things like that, they actually have a very narrow thermal range. And so, whereas they can swim to a new part of the ocean, and we'll see evidence of that in a minute, they can't, if they're in a river or something like that, they can't necessarily move out of that river, so they might be stuck there. And phenology is to do with the timing of things. So when things flower, when eggs are laid in relation to when insects are hatching for birds, when species migrate. So if they migrate up to the Arctic from the warmer parts of the world, are those systems that they rely on to get to the Arctic and to then feed when they're in the Arctic, are those still the same, or will they change over time and differentially from the bird? So this may affect species persistence a lot, and it will definitely affect ecosystem composition. So the illustration is the great tit, the oak, and the winter moth. So basically the great tits time their egg laying and their chicks hatching for the time when the winter moth is larva caterpillar is out there, and they time it for the new oak leaves, which have less tannins in. So as soon as that timing goes out, those 3 species will all be affected. Okay, it's probably be about another 5 minutes, or 10 minutes maybe. So the other thing that will happen if things can move is they will move. They will move to stay within their comfort zone. So they'll either move up mountains if they live on a hill, or they'll move horizontally if they can move horizontally towards the poles. Or in the case of Australia, they'll move towards the coast because they tend to be driven more by moisture than by temperature. And so you'll have range expansions and contractions. And you can remember these diagrams. So this shows the change in latitude of bird abundance in the US, and this shows the general pattern of species moving into an area and becoming extinct in an area. And so it's the ones that are kind of at the edge of the range at the back, where they're moving out, that are the most vulnerable to extinction, and the ones that are on the frontal side of the range moving in are the ones that tend to be able to, find new colonies and things like that. And so, as we found for humans when we looked at vulnerability, it depends not only on what they're exposed to, but how well they can adapt to that and how sensitive they are to those changes. And I say some species will be able to adapt very well, others won't be able to adapt. And if they can't adapt, obviously you're going to start to have extinctions, either of local populations or of entire species. I'm going to flick through these very quickly, because they're just, again, examples of, you remember we went through all the different terrestrial, coastal and marine ecosystems, and sort of had an example or two of each one. So basically, terrestrial ecosystems strongly affected by temperature and moisture, and also physical damage. There'll be problems for migratory species, but you may actually get a lot of extra plant growth because of the extra CO2 in the air, as long as they have enough water is the critical thing, and nutrients. They'll also be affected, of course, as will everything, by interactions with human activity, both in competition and also in fragmentation sizes. So can they move around, sort of freely to be able to adapt to climate change? So some of the barriers include the fact they can't move around, and that we've got rid of refugia by clearing habitat, and the fact that our governance systems, particularly with environmental conditions, tend to be towards overusing resources, polluting and degrading habitats, spreading diseases and weeds and things like that. So all of those things have a knock-on effect in addition to climate change. So in terms of management, obviously one of the key ones is protected areas. But we also need to move outside protected areas, because if you end up with just a few little handfuls of parks around and nothing else, those parks aren't going to survive for a start, because there's no connectivity between anything. So you need that connectivity across the landscape. We need to also look at where might be good refugia for species in the future, and make sure that they're conserved as well as what's happening now. And we need to build that connectivity. Basically, our design has to incorporate ecological systems as well as our own human systems too. And we could translocate, but fundamentally it's A, very expensive, B, you've got no idea whether you're actually incorporating all the key elements that that species needs, and you're taking away investment and management opportunities for things that aren't quite endangered at the moment, but will then become endangered because you've spent all the money and effort on something else. And we need to tackle climate change. All right, so coastal ecosystems. Obviously the key ones here are sea level rise, temperature changes, but fish can't cope with temperature changes. Storm damage and things on beaches, and ocean acidification. So if you remember those little shelled creatures in the ocean, the pteropods, but also anything else with a shell, that increased acidification starts to dissolve the shells. It dissolves coral reefs as well. And so this will lead to sort of changes in where things live, how they live, habitat types and things like that. So if you remember, we looked at turtles, for instance, and reptiles have a thermal range for their eggs, depending on the sex of the egg. So if it's kind of, I think if it's hot, it's male, and if it's cooler, it's female, and if it's in the middle, it's mixed. So immediately if it gets hot, you're going to have a predominance of one sex within that species, and so that's going to change, the ratios that survive and the ratios that come back and sort of, keep the next generation going. Again, there are interactions with human threats, particularly in coastal ecosystems where the majority of people live and use resources and things like that. And so some of the barriers are things like pollution and litter, because obviously our litter from the land goes straight to the coast first, and then it might get washed into the ocean and litter out there as well, but mainly coastal to start with. We build hard infrastructure, so things can't shuffle around because there's a road or a seawall or something there. And then obviously what we do on the land affects what's in the coastal ecosystems. So again, things like protected areas, they are important, they're just not the only solution. We need to make sure that we design our coastal infrastructure and building and things like that to allow species to move, not everywhere necessarily, but not going to knock down a suburb because it's on the coast, but you need to allow room around that. You need to make sure it's adapted to local conditions, again, has effective government. So there was a lot of, the main adaptation plan that's kind of been going on is often in cities that are prone to flooding. So coastal councils are very concerned, obviously, because they're going to be hit first by the kind of, a lot of the climate change impact. So they tend to have been the ones who are, starting to work on this stuff in advance of some of the others. So we need better connectivity and basically working out what you want in the long term and accepting there'll be changes along the way that may not necessarily follow your thing. And again, tackle climate change. All right, so now we get onto this fish. So if you remember this graph, it showed the average temperature that a fish survives at in terms of where it's been caught. And so you can see that over time, the fish temperature has gone up. So that means that fish originally were living, that they were catching had a temperature of around 25 degrees here, and now they're catching ones that have a temperature of around 26 degrees, where their habitat temperature, not the fish's temperature. So those fish are moving. So the fish that were at 25 degrees have now moved north or south to stay in cooler water, and the ones that were, in warmer water have moved in to occupy that area. And so that sort of, that key thing is sea temperature, both on the surface and underwater, and ocean acidification in marine ecosystems. So again, the barriers are not to do necessarily with climate change. They're to do with things like, added impacts from invasive species, overfishing, bad governance, and pollution. So common issues around all those ecosystems. And so again, we can have things like regulating fishing makes a very big difference, particularly quotas, where people have the ability to trade their quota if they don't want to use that, but you have a fixed quota. Things like preventing pollution, which again knocks off a lot of ecosystems for quite a long time. Controlling things like crown of thorns starfish or zebra mussels and things like that, which compete with the native species. Regulating use, so you don't want to have everywhere being used heavily because it's pretty and things like that, because it soon won't be. And again, protected areas, and again, climate change. Okay, so we're just going to flick through 3 slides on human impacts, and then we're going to have a break. So we've done the natural world, we've done, yes?
Since most of the ocean is international waters, do you know which governance takes care of that?
Well, there is an international rule of the sea, but the problem is that there isn't really anything that takes care of it, so it's badly used because the international waters are generally ungoverned. So some species, like whales, would be protected across international waters, but fisheries in general aren't protected. So that's why you have, fisheries from one country fishing on the far side of the world, because that's where the fish are. So moving on to humans. So if you remember The reality is that if you're working in this field, you will be mainly dealing with people and the consequences for them. And so you can get benefits for other, the natural world and things as well, but fundamentally people are interested in people. We're not interested so much. They may be interested in the natural world, but when it comes down to it, people are the ones that matter most. But there will be quite big consequences for people. So in terms of health, it's quite, there's a bunch of different things. So one's to do with the changes in range of different disease vectors and things like that. So malaria and dengue fever and things like that will start to spread further north or further south, away from the tropics and into more temperate regions. You'll have changes again in things like water and foodborne infections, because the conditions suit them better in hot weather and wet weather and stuff like that. You'll also have heat and cold stress, so probably more to do with heat stress than cold stress. But if you remember, our body maintains itself at a certain temperature, and particularly with heat stress, if you can't sweat to cool down, you overheat, and then you become, potentially fatally damaged by that. And so, I was going to say something about that. Oh, yeah. So if you remember, we looked at those examples of the heat wave in Europe, which isn't really used to heat waves that often. 25,000 people died in 2003, and then they had a big heat wave in Russia. I think it was 50,000 people died in Russia. So it has a big effect, and it also is very bad for making people who, for instance, already have a heart condition or respiratory problems, asthma or something, much more stressed and therefore much more prone to dying, because their body's coping with an additional stress from heat. And the other thing is that, when you have extreme events, you can actually have emotional and psychological stress from having to deal with that fear and, kind of not having your life destroyed, your house destroyed, your family possibly, losing someone in a flood or something like that. So those can be very traumatic, particularly for children who don't really understand that it doesn't have, that you can overcome it and things. There's also big consequences for, I've called this well-being, but it's the way that we live. So one of the big changes is going to be in terms of water supplies. So as climate systems move around and we potentially have more floods, more droughts, that's going to change the water supplies that we have. We're already, in many places, living right on the edge of our water supplies because we use so much for agriculture and for industry and things like that. The map here shows actually arable land, but we'll get to that in a minute. It'll also have an effect on food production. So not only will pests be able to change their ranges, pests and diseases of the crops. So we basically grow a handful of crops around the world that are exactly the same. And so they're very vulnerable to new pests and diseases, or pests and diseases going to new places that haven't had them before. So we grow wheat and rice and maize and things like that, corn. CO2 is likely to affect crop growth in a good way, potentially particularly C4 crops. But it's not likely to have a very good effect on livestock health, because most animals are, again, have a thermal tolerance that could well be exceeded. And if you look at cattle, for instance, they're often in a very exposed field with no trees or anything like that, so they can't shelter. And the other effect it has on crops, of course, is that if you remember, there were those studies saying that they lose their nutrient content in terms of when you eat them, you don't get as many nutrients out of it. So although you may have better growing crops, they might not actually be as good to eat. So the map does relate to arable land. And if you remember, this was from a study that showed that in terms of the actual climate conditions, arable land across the sub-Sahara down into places like Zambia and Zimbabwe and things like that, through Central America and the southern US, and also into Europe, were going to become worse. So that land became less suitable for crops, and the land that became more suitable was up here into northern Asia, Russia, Siberian places, and up into Canada, and then down into Argentina and potentially Chile, I suppose, but mainly Argentina. So that not only affects who's growing what, but how you can feed your own population, and the balance of power obviously related to that, because if you're having to import food from somewhere else because you can't feed your own population, it puts you at a political disadvantage. There'll also be population displacement and conflict over resources. So we already looked at, there was a slight effect on the Syrian conflict because they'd had very big droughts and things like that. If you start to get big flooding in places like Bangladesh, which are very, very vulnerable to sea level rise, where do all those people go to? They're not friends with the Indians generally, so it's unlikely that they would be able to be welcomed into India because they're Muslims, and that's not the way it goes. So what happens to those people when you suddenly have potentially millions of people wanting to move somewhere else because they can't live where they're living? And if you remember this, the American defense said that this was a, what was the phrase? Can't remember now. It was like a trigger for, for everything else. Climate change is basically exacerbating all these things that we already have going on in the world by kind of making it worse. And the other thing is obviously we'll have damage to property and stuff like that. So the last human consequence before we have our short break is an economic consequence. So damage from all those natural hazards, the storms and the droughts and the sea level rises and things like that, is very expensive. So we not only have lots of extra deaths and much higher costs, but it's used to calibrate risks. So it's often the thing that sort of says, how much will it cost if we allow this to go ahead? Because, obviously we work in an economic world. And if you remember, the Stern Review and a number of other reviews, except for that one in America, have all said that the cost of acting now is much cheaper than the cost of acting later, because we will have incurred that much more damage and things like that from having greater climate change than we will if we actually try and solve the problem now. And I think it was something like, I can't remember, 1% of GDP versus 5% of GDP, which is actually an awful lot of money if you think of global economies. And so he called the climate change the greatest market failure the world had ever seen, basically. And he said that basically you needed three things to address it. You couldn't sort of just accept that people were going to do it by themselves or companies were going to do it. So you needed to have a price on carbon that said, if you emit a lot, you pay for it. You needed to have policies which supported the implementation of low carbon technology. So instead of having vested interest, for instance, in the oil and gas fields, saying, well, we've got enough oil and gas for another 100 years, we'll just finish that off before we change over to something else. You actually reward people who use low carbon technology. And also you needed to remove barriers to energy efficiency and to educate people about climate change, and so that they would be happy to move in the right direction of, adopting these new technologies and things like that. And then the final thing on the economic cost was that, we basically insure against disasters and stuff like that, most people. So, you have your house insured or your contents insured or your car insured or whatever. And those insurance systems sort of operate around the world. And they obviously are very good at assessing the risk because they want to make a profit. So what they want to make sure is that your insurance premiums are more than their costs will be. And so that's, obviously the way they operate. But they don't know anything about climate change because we don't know what the effects are going to be. So they look at historical risk and say, is it worth insuring this person and how much will it cost? But they can't do that with climate change, so they're in a bit of trouble, really. And when you look at natural disasters around the world, the insurance generally covers about a third of the cost, and the state or the taxpayer covers the rest of the cost. So you can see that if those costs mount up, the insurance companies are not going to bear that cost. It's going to be society in general, and therefore it's in our interest to try and make sure that we reduce the costs and can kind of not end up spending all our taxes on fixing things and not being able to have education and, pensions and all the rest of it. Okay, short break. Just actually, do you want to go on or just have a short break? Yep. No? Don't mind? Break? No break? Okay, 2 minutes. Go and have stretch your legs, go to the loo, whatever you need to do. Jump up and down. Okay, we'll kick off again because we're more than halfway through, but you know we might as well not. I kind of want to get to the end of this one, or at least to the second last slide anyway. All right, so we're going to talk mainly about adaptation, but of course we can have mitigation as well. So mitigation is reducing CO2 basically, or greenhouse gases. So we're basically taking it out of the atmosphere or not releasing it in the first place, or cooling the planet in some way or other. So there's different approaches, and the reason that mitigation isn't looked at quite so much is that they're all pretty well untested methods that could potentially have horrible, horrible effects. So things like solar reflectors and stuff like that. I mean, A, we can't build them. B, you've got absolutely no idea what it's going to do, so it's not necessarily a good idea. But removal of CO2 from the atmosphere is one method. So you can either increase the amount that's taken up by soils or by plants. So things like biochar are being investigated now, where you burn stuff and you bury it. And it not only improves the soil, but it buries that CO2 away. You can also fertilize the ocean to increase algal growth, and of course algae being a plant absorbs CO2 and then they die and they take that to the bottom of the ocean. So it's again a way of storing CO2 away from the atmosphere. We also have the more technological ones, which is why people think there can be clean coal and things, which is actually scrubbing out CO2 as you emit it, or that's already in the atmosphere and burying it underground or something like that. So the reality with that is it's way too expensive and it doesn't really work very well at the moment. So it's not that it shouldn't be looked at, but it's not a solution right now. The other one that we looked at, in fact, in that lecture on biophysical feedbacks was changing the albedo, which actually is, some of it's potentially kind of doable, but then you don't really know what effect you'll have. You have to do it on a temporary basis so you can see if it's going to have some horrible side effect. So the kind of more out there ones are things like solar screening, where you reflect the sunlight before it comes in. Slightly more logical one is something like cloud whitening, with either different particles or different cloud densities. And again, that reflects the solar energy before it comes in. But also, remember, it had that effect where it might warm what was underneath, because you're keeping the air trapped in underneath. And the other one, which is potentially okay in small areas, is surface whitening. So in a built environment, you can definitely do it. So you change things like roads from black to, pale cement, or you paint your roof white, or you have sort of pale pavements and things like that. You can also change, to some extent, the kind of albedo of agricultural fields by growing different crops, or by having, large amounts of plastic on the between the crops and things like that, although that's sort of kind of got its own issues with environmental pollution. And something I saw quite recently was in Switzerland. They're replenishing a glacier at the moment because it's a tourist thing, so they're actually just spraying a lot of water on it, a lot of water, one would presume, to make sure that it doesn't melt too quickly. So that's obviously another one that could be done. So whitening, using snow to whiten, mountains and things like that, potentially. Just redistributing the water, I suppose. Anyway, so mainly we've looked at adaptation. So again, you will have obviously done a lot of this in your essays and things like that. So there's 4 kinds. We can anticipate a change, really make sure we understand it and everything's in place to deal with that change. We can plan adaptation, which is a sort of a subset of anticipatory adaptation. So you've kind of made a policy decision that you will, cope with this sea level rise or whatever it is. There's reactive adaptation, which is the one that normally happens, which is that you have something happen, and then after it's happened, you think, gosh, we better make sure that that doesn't happen again. And so you kind of, adapt in retrospect rather than in advance. And then you have autonomous adaptation, which is something that, like species movement and things, changes happen. The species doesn't think, oh, hell, I better move, 100 kilometers away. It just shifts along in response to that change. So it's not a conscious change. We'll just go through this very quickly. So this is the whole process you went through in your essays. So first 2, so what are the risks? What's the vulnerability? How do we get to an agreed outcome? How do we choose the right actions? Making that choice, talking to stakeholders, working out what the costs and benefits and things are. How do we implement it? What's the timescale? Who's involved? And then how do we check whether our actions have been any good, whether we need to adjust them, whether we need to have a completely different outcome. But there are also barriers to adaptation. So, human societies are complex, and there's a number of reasons why people either don't want to or can't adapt. So we're going to all the mental stuff and, values and beliefs a bit later on. But basically, you needed good leadership. If you didn't have good leadership, there was no one direction to go in, pardon the band thing. But so you kind of milled around, nobody knew what was happening. One person did this, one person wanted to do something else. So that was a critical element that cut across all the phases of adaptation planning. You also needed resources, so not just in terms of money, but in terms of knowledge and equipment and things like that. So, you can't tell somebody to go and, raise their house up on stilts if you don't actually give them any plans or any assistance to do that or something like that. So you need that resource to actually make the thing happen. We need really good communication and information at the level of interest to and at, appropriate to whoever you're talking to. So there's no point in kind of going and talking to, kind of bunch of teenagers about, kind of high scientific physics, because they're probably not interested and they're probably not going to understand you anyway. So some of them will, the physicists, but not the others. So you need to make sure that not only do you communicate clearly, but you also communicate an appropriate level, and that it's done in a manner when it's useful, not, sort of after the event or well before the event, that you make sure that that information is there and in a timely fashion. And then you run across all these things, which I say we'll go into later, about why people don't want to react because they like to be the same way that they are now because it's comfortable, which is fair enough. Or that they have a belief system that says you shouldn't do one particular thing, and that's the thing you want them to do. So basically, if we want to make adaptation planning a success, we have to build confidence and usefulness of our adaptation plan and its process. So we need to make sure that everyone who's affected at least has an opportunity to be engaged, and that people who aren't affected are reassured that they're not going to have their lives turned upside down. And you need to go in this common direction. So, you know, people may have different views and things like that, but as long as you get to a common goal, they probably won't mind so much about it. Fixing that convergence is the critical thing, because as I said, it doesn't matter how you get to that place. Like, some people might want to do one thing, some people might want to do another, but if you're not heading to the same place, you won't come up with a solution to your flooding problem or your cyclone problem or whatever it is. You need to have clear actions and tools and logic behind the program that you set out to make that adaptation plan work. So people need to know exactly what they can do, what they're meant to do, you know, the range of potential options they can have. And then you need to make sure that it's based on the right kind of evidence, so not only from experts, but also from local people and from governments and things like that, because they will all have different inputs and interests and things like that. So if you come in as a scientist or as a planner or something like that, and you just tell people what to do, and you haven't brought them on board, you won't get that plan followed up at all. Then we looked at the fact that there were a range of planning adaptation tools that are very commonly used, so probably always a combination of things. So we have laws, obviously, that come into place and sort of say, you know, you must comply with this law and the sea level will be 1 metre high, and that's what you've got to do. We then have the most useful thing as a geographer is spatial planning. So you work out where the hazards are, what are appropriate land uses in different parts of the landscape that you're working in, and that's sort of governed by zoning and building regulations then to sort of the specifics of what your built environment's going to be like. So you wouldn't build like a key hospital on a flood-prone area because it's not going to be very sensible. You can also then have things like financial incentives. So, you know, if people do the right thing, or they, you know, get a little bit of a tax break or something like that, if they, you know, they comply with the regulations, everyone likes to have a bit of financial incentive. So, like, we had solar panels put on our house, we got a lot back in terms of feeding into the grid. We got a good payment for what we fed into the grid. You also need to make sure that the community is involved in and keen on what you're doing and feels that they're in control of what you're doing, because, as I say, nobody likes being told what to do very much. And the way that you can, the different approaches, I suppose, that can be used. So we can, in our adaptation planning, we can sort of build protective infrastructure. We can build, you know, flood prevention dams, we can build walls and levees, we can change how buildings are constructed. We can also decide that one place is just not really very suitable in terms of future climate, and we'll just move people out of there or change the land use. You can only do farming there, or you can only do, you know, have a park there. You can't sort of have houses there. And so, as I say, that feeds into the land use change. And so we may have, in the end, things like, you know, where you used to grow wheat, you will suddenly be growing something else that grows better in a, you know, hotter, drier climate or something like that, so people will adapt. So we're going to look at the kind of infrastructure side of it a bit. So there are probably 3 key things. So there's what the landscape does, what you do in terms of buildings, and what you do in terms of the whole city or neighbourhood or something like that. So in terms of the landscape, if you understand how your landscape operates, where different microclimates are, so things like fire proneness, if you're building on the top of a, you know, a north-facing slope, or west-facing slope, you're likely to be much more vulnerable to fire than if you're at the bottom of a south-facing slope. The way that water moves across the landscape or wind moves across the landscape. What's very changeable, so beaches and foredunes and things like that are very changeable. They're very dynamic. So when you have a storm come along, it whips the sand away, and that sand's then replenished over a few months. So you don't want to be building on that kind of landscape. But one of the key things was that our interventions need to be no regrets action. So if by any chance we sort of say, well, we're designing for a kind of a 20-metre flood here and everything's got to be, within that flood zone, you never actually get a 20-metre flood. Would your conditions that you've improved, that you've changed, still be better than they were before? Or would they be really awful and everyone be very cross if you didn't get a 20-metre flood because you'd made them move or you'd made them live in a high-rise or something like that? So they're huge problems in the earth. I mean, obviously one of them sort of sustainable development. So all the stuff that goes into pollution and over-resource use and overcrowding and this, that and the other, poverty and stuff. If you can fix some of those at the same time as you address climate change, then you end up with a better solution whether or not climate change comes along, which it is going to come along. We just don't know how much is going to come along. And then the fact is that we can't obviously design for every single risk. So inside that planning process and things like that, we need to know that we've done the best that we can for the risks that are foreseeable, but not necessarily for any risk. And we need to understand that there are trade-offs involved in, whatever we do. You can never have something that's kind of totally fantastic. It's usually got some kind of drawback to it. But is that drawback small enough that it doesn't matter? Okay. So in terms of buildings, we looked at a number of things. So cities are going to face, or buildings are going to face, much hotter conditions, potentially colder conditions at times. So if you get living in the North America or something, you're in the middle of those polar vortex storms, then you're going to have to be able to cope with cold. Flooding is probably a given in many places, and extra strong winds and stuff like that, and then obviously fire in places that are fire prone. So your passive design of your actual house can make a huge difference to your resource use and your comfort. So in terms of how much electricity you might use, obviously we really want to cut down on electricity use to some extent because that's one of the massive CO2 emitting industries. So, if you design your house so it's kind of shady in the summer and exposed to the sun in the winter, and it gets warmed up in the winter, and it's got nice breezes and stuff like that, it makes a big difference. So this example here was the cyclone-proof houses in Fiji. So if you remember, they were quite cheap and quick to construct. And because they were screwed together rather than nailed together and stuff, they actually stood up to the cyclone very successfully and kept those people safe and, were fine the next post the cyclone. So they still had a home to be in and stuff like that and could get on with their lives to some extent. You also had things like this quite space-age looking house that was designed to be to be fireproof. So it's built under soil, which obviously doesn't burn, and it's got these huge metal shades that keep embers and things out from the actual inside of the house, which might catch fire. So there's a lot we can do in terms of building design. So how much we can adapt existing buildings is one thing. You can obviously make some changes, but obviously with new buildings, as soon as you start to think about, this is what we've got to aim for, you can make a big difference to how people survive climate disruption events, extreme events, and things like that. You can also do the same thing with cities, and is being done in cities. So this example, if you remember, was Singapore. So they had a drainage channel which they needed to fix up. So in the fixing up of it, they still kept a bit of the drainage channel, but they made the rest of it into this really nice park. So it still has the ability to take the flood water and stuff like that, but it's a place where people can go. It provides, cool sort of air for the city, provides greenery for species and things like that. And so again, they're facing the same things. So they're facing things like heating, flooding, livability, overuse of resources, whether you can, cut down on your resources. And so if you remember, we looked at different adaptation measures that either had been taken or were being taken around the world in terms of, having much wider streets with green shady trees which cool the air and therefore, pleasant to be in for a start and also cooling. You could reuse water, so you could recycle water that fell into the, again, in a design phase, not necessarily in an adaptation phase, so that you could, use it to cool in the summer, but also, recycle the water for use in the city and in industry and things like that, rather than letting it run off. Parks and lakes are very cool, much cooler than the surrounding buildings. So if you put them in the right place with the upwind, they will release cool air over the city again. So some of those things had, kind of slight drawbacks and stuff like that. Obviously, if you've got an upwind lake in a cold winter situation, then it's going to cool you rather than warm you. But in general, if you look at your major discomforts and go for those ones, it's probably the right way to go. Okay. So we've built our cities and our houses to be resilient to natural disasters, but we need to build the resilience of the people within them, so the communities and the individuals who live within them. And so we have a couple of definitions here, but basically resilience is the ability to sort of survive a disaster or an event that's, damaging to your community or your surroundings, and to still keep functioning and to recover from that event in a reasonable amount of time. So if something happens like New Orleans and you just don't go back to that place ever again, and large parts of the city are still unlived in, that's not resilient. It was just broken at that point that Hurricane Katrina came through. But other places, most places, people recover. And it's just a question of how well they recover and how quickly they recover. So there's a lot of facets of community resilience. So we had a whole lecture on this, and I'm condensing it into kind of a slide or two. But basically they came down to there are properties in the system. So we have social systems, networks and things like that operate the same way that any other system operates. So it has feedbacks. So you need to know, when you can change, points when you can change, points when you can't necessarily keep the same way. It has the ability to reorganize itself. So if something really isn't working in one particular situation, can it be changed so it becomes a different system, but it still works to get the same result in the end? Is it something that, a bit of it can be out of action, but the rest of it can still keep on functioning and providing, the community needs? So the example there was the ambulance. You had a single ambulance that could break down, didn't matter, there would be a replacement ambulance. The whole system was governed by sort of central control. And then the ability to kind of, gather together knowledge and resources quickly when they were needed, and then disperse them when they weren't needed. So there were things like the Haiti example of the earthquake, and then things like the way that an army operates. If an army is being attacked, they swarm resources into that area and they deal with their attack, and then they disperse afterwards. But there are also properties of communities that can be changed to make them more resilient. But if you have these properties in your community, you are, tend to be a resilient community. So one was things like, they called it habits of mind, but it's basically how you have a common purpose in some ways. Because if you have a strong community, they have a purpose in remaining, even as that community can be as the purpose, or whatever it is. But if you're all moving in the same direction, you don't have to worry about the little bits along the side, because you have your goal of restoring whatever it was that you've lost. You need to have real faith in who's in control of different resources and different control structures, I suppose, because most people live in areas where they've got a council, or they've got a government or whatever, and if you don't trust them and you think they're not really out to help you, then that's a very bad thing for resilience, because they are the people who can help you in the long run with inputs of resources and money and things like that. You need to be have trust in your community and be cooperative. So again, that's just something that a good community, you'll all know, whether it's a real community or online community or whatever it is, your network of people who you're close to, they trust each other and they help each other. It's fairly obvious. But then the thing, I guess, which is quite interesting, is that actually having a diversity of views, a diversity of knowledge and things like that is very beneficial, because if something happens that's outside your experience, you know, you can't necessarily deal with it because you haven't had to deal with it before. And so if you have a whole bunch of different people with different knowledge and different experience, it's very good. And the other thing, again, which you've already mentioned, is strong leadership, not necessarily from the kind of the mayor or something, but just somebody who can, in an emergency, can react in a way to bring the people together and provide them with some goal to follow, you know, to aim for. And obviously social networks are, you know, kind of in amongst that sort of thing too. I think we'll be okay, actually. So I want to get to the end because it's a kind of whole lecture. So building resilience, we want to be positive. So don't tell people they can't do something, but tell them what they can do, and that gives them an action that they can follow and allows them to kind of move on with something, as opposed to being kind of shut off and disempowered. I think getting people to believe that everyone else is, you know, joining in the action, that, you know, it's going to come out with a good outcome at the end of it, that, you know, we're all moving together is very important. So being a social citizen within your community is an important thing. And being prepared, so making things that change behaviour or take actions or identify vulnerabilities that are easy for people to recognise and to actually then follow. So if you want somebody to start cleaning up after a massive flood, you tell them that first of all they need to do A, and then they need to do B, and then they know what they're meant to be doing, and they can just go off and do it in their own, you know, time and ability and stuff like that. And the same thing, the trust in authorities. So we also then, as a subset of the community resilience, looked at personal resilience. And this applies not only to you as a person, as an individual, but also you as a person dealing with people who've been affected by disasters, if you know what I mean, because they will react in ways that are affected by, for instance, so you need to know yourself first, but also, you know, if somebody's just lost their house or they've lost their dog or something like that in a flood, you know, they're going to be into these stages of grief and loss. And so understanding why people are in denial or why they're angry or why they're depressed, you know, it's important to know that people will not be feeling happy and optimistic necessarily at this particular stage, and that you can, that's fine, you know, it doesn't matter. You can just, you know, help them through the process if you can. But the reality is that if you have a disaster and you kind of weigh up what's around you, know what's happened, you identify where you want to be, that you know, you kind of put your roof back onto your house or something, you can then take the steps that you need to get there. So that recognizing what's happened and then knowing where you want to be, your goal or outcome, is the sort of thing that allows you to become active instead of sitting around feeling depressed and sad and hopeless. You know, you actually can then start to get on with rebuilding whatever it is that's been damaged. There was also that thing about you could learn to be more optimistic. So people, I think, are kind of, you know, possibly naturally pessimistic or optimistic. But depending on how you take events that occur, whether you take them personally or you feel helpless or something like that, you know, if you can go through that stage but then change it around maybe to be more optimistic and think, well, you know, whatever happened, wasn't personal, I can just get on with building the next thing, then that helps you to overcome disasters and stuff. You also need to know that because there was a storm, it wasn't directed at you personally, it was just a storm going through its process, didn't care whether you were there or not, so it's not kind of personal vindictiveness. And then at a personal level, in that disaster preparedness, we need to know that you need to be informed, you need to be engaged in what's going on around you, so you need to know where you find information about floods or cyclones or whatever, tornadoes, whatever it is, and then make sure that you are keeping up with warnings, you know what to do in the event of a fire, and that your interests are the same as the community around you, so you're not conflicting with them. All right, so we've got business now. We're getting there. Gosh, I'm going to have to talk quickly. All right, so business, Business and climate policy, as I say, what you need to know for the exam is in here, because I didn't know what was in here before I wrote the exam. So business obviously is a huge part of the problem of climate change, because they're the people who've emitted most of the emissions, but they're also obviously part of the solution, because they're big emitters, and therefore if they change their emissions and their policies and things like that, they can be, very much part of the solution. So this actually looks mainly at what's affecting businesses. So they have direct impacts, so they have different competition for resources, and that may change. So you might have a mine in a place, and then you find that it suddenly, start getting sea level rise, and it starts flooding, you've got to start pumping it out, and blah, blah, blah. So you might be getting, food resources from somewhere, and that suddenly changes. There are also conditions for workers. So heat stress is a big one, because often workers are exposed to, hot, stressful conditions. So if you start to get hot weather, it's going to be bad. And you can also have damage, obviously, to your infrastructure. But then businesses are also affected by things like, what their shareholders, their employees, and their customers want. So particularly customer pressure is actually quite a strong way of changing, how business reacts to, different events. So if you're particularly polluting business and your customers suddenly say they don't want pollution, they want you to be responsible, and they start buying elsewhere, then that really persuades you to change. And climate change will probably change costs and also the policy interventions that you might have to deal with. So things like carbon pricing affects your business profitability and things. But there's also responsibility to be sustainable. So we looked at some of those corporations in a different lecture, actually, the Peugeot and things that recycle a lot of their aluminium and stuff now. So, they're people who are choosing to, for economic reasons, not necessarily for, particularly green reasons, but economic and sustainable reasons, they're choosing to sort of change the way they operate. And some companies, are proactive in that regard, and others aren't. So that's what it says here. Basically, you go through phases where you say, I'm not going to change, I'm happy the way it is, it's making me lots of money, and then you sort of maybe get regulations, oh shit, I've got to comply with that, and then eventually you think, oh, sorry, I'll just go for broke and do the good thing. So obviously part of what business is dealing with is energy. And so the reason that we're in the problem that we're in mainly is because we're using energy to drive industrial processes and, cars and things like that. And so energy is going to increase. So the predictions are it will increase by 50% in the next 20-odd years. So we have to kind of cope with that at the same time as reducing emissions. So we can be energy efficient and we can be more energy intense. So for each bit of energy we use, we get more stuff out of it. There's also, we'll look at the differences in sources of energy. So we're going to look at a table in a sec that kind of shows some of the pros and cons. But you have a whole bunch of non-renewable resources which are easy. We use them at the moment, they do exactly what we want them to do, except they produce a lot of pollution. We also have renewables, so they're new, they're kind of a bit scattered around, so they don't have kind of big central processing necessarily, power generation out of them necessarily. And they include things like solar, wind, and biofuels. And then there are potentially new fuels coming on, like hydrogen, which, if it can get off the ground, obviously it would be a wonderful thing, but we don't know yet whether it will get off the ground. And one of the issues with renewable energy is that it's not necessarily on demand. So your coal sits there, or your oil and gas just sits there waiting to be generated. But if you're using something that actually is generated as and when it's the sun shining or the wind's blowing or whatever, you have to be able to store it in some way so that you can overcome that mismatch between peak demand and peak production, if you know what I mean. So there's definitely technology. Amanda went through that in terms of better batteries, pumping water up to a high place so that you can use that for hydroelectric power when you want it, sort of compressing air underground, so again that can drive a generator. And just quickly, we won't go into this, but basically both renewables and non-renewables have advantages and disadvantages. And so really what we need to do is overcome the disadvantages of renewables and make them into much stronger advantages, so these no longer are advantages. So we can swap like for like. Things like biofuels are good because they are a direct replacement for both petrol to some extent and definitely for diesel. But there's also problems with things like biofuels because they compete with food for space. So you're not only using space in terms of agricultural fields and things, but you're also using the same crop potentially. So maize or corn can be a biofuel or it can be a food. So, really the food's much more important in some regards, but if you're getting a better profit off biofuel production, you will change to selling it for biofuels. And so, each of those things has a kind of a plus and a minus that you need to kind of work around and increase, obviously, the pluses from renewables and the minuses from non-renewables. Oh, shit, we're going quick. Okay, so energy policy. So basically we have the Paris Agreement. We've got to keep underneath that, technically. There's not such a predictable relationship between economic growth and CO2 emissions because people are becoming more efficient. They've got different industries, so they're not using power-hungry industries necessarily. You've got service industries and stuff. And so, that relationship that you have to have CO2 emissions to have growth is no longer necessarily coming into effect. And the thing we've seen often actually around the world to some regard is that people want a price on carbon because some people have carbon emission schemes, others don't. Business wants certainty to be able to deal with this. And so in Australia, the Finkel Review is due soon, which is into the energy industry. And it basically says that there are going to be big changes in sources, affordability. We've got to have an agreed approach to energy reduction, and we've got to have predictability. And they actually are going to come out with and say that they want an emissions intensity scheme, which is basically a carbon tax. And the Liberal government is not going to do a carbon tax, so that one's ruled out of the way. So in terms of policy, what we want is, for the polluters to pay for their pollution, both now and historically. We want a long-term view and a common good outcome, and we want sort of a sustainable development view of equality across space and time. So we have kind of reluctantly some regard to Paris Agreement, but it's voluntary, so people have agreed to do things that they're not really going to meet their emissions at the present rate of voluntary agreement, but we don't know kind of how that will change. And for instance, if America withdraws, we don't know whether that will catalyse other countries to kind of punish America or whether they'll just say, oh good, we'll withdraw too. So that's kind of up in the air. So at the moment we have very poor policies in Australia. We have a very polarised political view of what you should do, and there's no certainty, and we're not on track to meet Paris targets. And as I say, the Liberals are ideologically opposed to carbon price, so we're not going to go that way as long as they're in power, and possibly not if the Labour are in power either. But the states are doing really well. So if you remember, ACT and Canberra already have pretty much 100% renewable energy. Other states aren't doing so well at the moment, but they're all aiming for good stuff. So maybe the federal government won't do anything, but the states will bring Australia into, being able to cut its emissions properly. Just very quickly, IPCC, I realised I hadn't mentioned this, but they're the body that kind of looks into understanding climate change and its impacts and how we can deal with it, formed in 1988. They are the people who predict our current climate predictions, what will happen. So they work on those representative concentration pathways, which are different emission scenarios based on different socioeconomic trajectories, ranging from, 8 watts per metre squared, which is about probably 3 or 4 degrees centigrade, down to 2.6, which is probably around 1.5, 2 degrees centigrade. So they've replaced the former ones. All right, sorry, I'm not going to make it, but basically we're in a bad place. We've got climate change coming. We know that it's bad. We're doing nothing about it, or very little about it. because we're paralysed. Because, sorry, this is going to take 5 minutes. Okay. We perceive risk badly. So we don't see the real risk in things. If it's familiar, we don't rate it as highly as unfamiliar. We don't realise how preventable it is or not. We discount problems from the future for people we don't know, for people who live in a distant place. So, the reality is that we don't see climate change for a lot of people as actually being an important thing, as important as kind of getting a job, wage rise or something like that, whereas in reality it actually is very important. And part of the reason is because of the way that we think about stuff. So we have different perspectives. So we have our mental and world views. We have the fact that, beliefs cannot be tested. So if you don't believe climate change is happening, you can't prove, you can't make somebody change that belief necessarily. If things happen slowly enough, so creeping normalcy and landscape amnesia, we kind of accept that that's the way it is, and we forget that, 20 years ago, whatever, it was different. Probably don't remember 20 years ago, but 15 years ago. We also have a big resistance to change, and there's the tragedy of the commons, which means that, individuals might be better off by acting selfishly, but everyone else is worse off in the long run, including the individual. And climate change is a horrible problem. It's big and complex and difficult to deal with. So our mental models are how we process things, and they're based on our knowledge and experience. And we filter new information through that. So we hear new information, we think, does it agree with our mental model? No. And then we reject it, or yes, and we accept it. And that's largely, partly at least, down to evolutionary. So we have an interest in our own selves. That was the only thing that kept us alive in a large part of our evolutionary history. And we want to know that we're important in the group, and we want to imitate what the rest of the group is doing, because that makes us acceptable in the group. And basically, if you were shunned in the early days, you probably got eaten by a hyena. So it wasn't a good survival mechanism. We also believe things that support our views, and we tend to disbelieve things that don't, so it takes a lot of evidence to make you change your mind, and we like to take one simple action if possible and hope that will solve the problem, which of course it very rarely does. Risk perception we've dealt with. We also have only so many things we can worry about. So, we're worried about near things, whether our kids will do well at school, whether we'll do well in exams, get our degree, whatever, not about things that happen way in the future. We also have this massive thing with denial. So basically, denial is the need to be innocent about a troubling recognition, or Freud's rather preferred definition, which I love. So denial is very hard to overcome, because people are doing the very best they can to pretend it's not happening, even though they know that it is. So you can't sort of convince them by giving them more facts, because they actually already know what the problem is. They just don't want to admit it. And so there are loads of things like, conspiracy theories. It's all a conspiracy by China to make the US economy bad, and, kind of fake experts, selective data, pick the 1 year that was cooler and say it can't possibly be global warming, change proof, false analogies, blah, blah. Okay. So we can't convey the message because of a whole bunch of different things. So I won't go through these. They're all in that lecture on stuff. But there's the way that we operate, there's the way that science and that climate change is conveyed, which has uncertainty in it, which means half people think, well, it's actually not happening, not that it's uncertain about the amount. Things like costs and growth and development. It's going to cost a lot, it'll interfere with our growth and development, make us all have a bad lifestyle, we'll all go back to kind of slaving in a field with a small pickaxe, sort of. The media is awful. The media presenting of climate change is very mixed, very biased. It's very difficult to kind of get to know what the true story is. And we get used to the status quo. So we had all these barriers: distance, doom, dissonance, denial, and identity. And so the way forward was to, use social networks to bring people on board and be, happy with the fact you're all going the same place. To be supportive, so be positive rather than negative. So don't criticize people, but offer them, other solutions or alternatives. Make change easy. So don't make it very hard to change, just make it simple to change. A small change is fine. Create a good story so that people are sucked in and, happy to go along. Not sucked in, that's the wrong phrase, but, kind of pulled into the kind of narrative of it. Everyone likes a story. And then make sure that you have signals that sort of say, yes, we're getting there, or no, we're not getting there. So the same as that evaluation stuff. All right. And so then there was this stuff about being what you would do as a